Before we begin tonight, consider what you know about life. You know it needs sunlight. You learned that in school. Photosynthesis. The sun drives everything. Plants capture light, animals eat plants, and the entire web of life hangs suspended from that one star 93 million miles away. Take the sun away, and the whole thing collapses. That is the story. That has always been the story. It is wrong. Beneath your feet, right now, as you lie in bed or sit wherever you are, there is another biosphere. A second living world that has nothing to do with the sun. No light reaches it. No oxygen in many places. No seasons, no weather, no night or day. Just heat, pressure, darkness, and rock. Kilometer after kilometer of ancient cold stone, stretching down to the edge of where temperature becomes too extreme even for the most extraordinary survivors. And in that darkness, something lives. Not metaphorically, not in some theoretical or speculative sense. Actually lives, actually moves, actually eats, actually reproduces. Bacteria and archaea and fungi, pressed into hairline fractures in rock, suspended in ancient water that has not touched the surface in tens of millions of years. Some of them eat radioactivity. Some of them breathe sulfur. Some of them divide so slowly that a single cell might take 1,000 years to become 2 cells. Some of them have been cut off from the surface world for longer than the dinosaurs have been gone. Welcome to Sleepy Science Stories. Tonight we are going somewhere genuinely alien. Not to another planet, not to another star system, but to a place that exists right here, right now, beneath the surface of our own world. A place that most life on Earth has never visited and could not survive. A hidden ecosystem so large, so ancient, so biologically strange, that discovering it forced scientists to rewrite the boundaries of what life is allowed to be. This is the deep biosphere. And it is one of the most remarkable scientific discoveries of the last 100 years. We will begin with the numbers, with the sheer scale of this hidden world and what it means for our understanding of life on Earth. We will descend layer by layer through the rock and into the dark. We will meet the organisms that live there. We will learn how they eat, how they survive, how they exist in conditions that should be entirely incompatible with life. And yet, they are not. Life found a way. We will meet a bacterium named after a Jules Verne character. It was discovered living completely alone, 2.8 kilometers beneath a gold mine in South Africa, in water that had not been connected to the sky for 25 million years. A bacterium that is an entire ecosystem by itself, the only known species to live in total isolation from every other living thing on Earth. A bacterium named the Bold Traveler. We will ask what this means for the search for life elsewhere in the solar system. And we will sit with a thought that is equal parts humbling and astonishing. The most common form of life on this planet may not be the life we see when we open our eyes. It may be the life that has never seen light at all. The deep biosphere was not discovered by people who were looking for it. It was discovered by accident, by engineers and geologists doing practical work in mines and oil fields, who kept finding things that should not have been there. Bacteria in deep oil reservoirs, microbes in ancient groundwater, organisms in core samples from boreholes sealed for years. Each of these discoveries was initially explained away. Contamination, error, artifacts of the sampling process. The assumption that deep rock was sterile was so strong that evidence against it was dismissed for decades. The scientists who eventually proved the deep biosphere was real had to fight against the weight of that assumption. They developed new protocols, new equipment, new standards of proof. And when the proof came, it was overwhelming. Not a few isolated findings, but a pattern that repeated everywhere they looked. Life. Deep down, living on rock, eating chemistry, doing what it had always done, in the dark, without us. If Sleepy Science Stories has been part of your evenings, please consider liking or subscribing. Every listener is part of a surface world that turns out to be only one thin layer of something much, much deeper. Let your body relax. Let your breath slow. Let your imagination begin its descent. Down through the soil, through the bedrock, past the roots of mountains, into the dark where something extraordinary has been quietly living for longer than any surface creature can comprehend. Let us begin. The deep biosphere is not a comfortable discovery. It does not make us more central to the story. It makes us more peripheral. We are recent arrivals on a planet that has been alive, in its own quiet way, for nearly 4 billion years. What we call life, the visible, sunlit, rapid surface kind, is the newest chapter. The deep biosphere is the original. And it is still running. Tonight we go down to meet it. There is one more thing worth knowing before the descent. The discovery of the deep biosphere did not happen in a single moment. It accumulated slowly, over decades, as the evidence became impossible to dismiss. As the methods improved and the contamination controls tightened, and the findings kept coming back the same. Life. Down there. Real. Ancient. Alive. The scientists who did this work had to argue for it at conferences and in papers and in funding applications against colleagues who were confident the results were artifacts. The history of this discovery is the history of a paradigm being dismantled piece by people who were willing to follow the evidence wherever it led. Tonight we follow it together. The first thing you need to understand about the deep biosphere is its size. Because the size changes everything. We think of Earth as a planet covered in life, and by surface standards it is. The oceans teem with creatures. The land supports forests and prairies and deserts full of organisms from microbes to mammals. Life is everywhere we can see it, everywhere we think to look. But for most of human history, we assumed that life thinned out quickly as you moved underground. A few meters of soil, rich with bacteria and fungi and invertebrates. A few more meters of rock, increasingly bare. And then, from some point downward, pure geology. Rock and heat and mineral process. No biology. Just the planet's dead machinery running in the dark. This assumption was not unreasonable. It made sense. Life, as we understood it, needed energy from the sun, either directly through photosynthesis or indirectly through the food chains photosynthesis supports. Remove the sun, and you remove the foundation. Go deep enough, and there is no food, no light, no oxygen. Temperatures would destroy the proteins every organism needs to function. Life, under that framework, was a surface phenomenon. Everything below was sterile machinery. The assumption was wrong. The first serious hints came in the 1920s and 30s, when researchers studying oil fields began finding bacteria in geological formations far below the surface. These discoveries were set aside. The assumption was contamination. The bacteria had been introduced during drilling. They could not possibly be native to those depths. Resolving that debate required decades of methodological development. Scientists needed ways to drill into deep rock, collect samples, and verify with confidence that any organisms found were genuinely ancient and not recent introductions from surface equipment. By the 1980s and 90s, those methods existed. The discoveries that followed were extraordinary. Life was found not just a few meters down. It was found at 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, 5 kilometers in some locations, and not just surviving in some barely there dormant sense, but metabolically active, eating, processing chemistry. Living. The estimates for the total biomass of the deep biosphere have shifted dramatically as more data has come in. Current best estimates from the major surveys of the Deep Carbon Observatory suggest that the deep subsurface contains somewhere between 15 and 23 billion tons of carbon in living organisms. That number needs a moment to land. For comparison, all humans on Earth represent approximately 0.06 billion tons of carbon. All the fish in the ocean, roughly 0.8 billion tons. All the plants on land, roughly 450 billion tons. The deep biosphere is enormous by any measure. Some estimates suggest it may account for roughly 15% of all the biomass on Earth, and almost none of it has ever been seen by human eyes. The deep biosphere extends to depths of around 10 kilometers beneath the continental surface and 21 kilometers beneath the sea surface, bounded ultimately not by geology but by temperature. Organisms seem to top out at around 120 degrees Celsius. Above that threshold, the proteins that make life work begin to fall apart. That thermal boundary kilometers beneath our feet is the true floor of the living world. Between the surface and that floor, there is an enormous volume of rock. In the cracks and pores and fracture networks that run through that rock, there is water. Ancient water in many cases, isolated from the surface for millions or hundreds of millions of years. And in that water, suspended in hairline fractures between mineral grains, clinging to rock surfaces in thin biofilms, there is life. The numbers suggest that roughly 70% of all bacteria and archaea on Earth live in the subsurface. Not 10%. Not a quarter. 70. We have been studying the surface world for all of human history. We have spent centuries cataloging its organisms, mapping its ecosystems, building an entire science of biology around what we can see. And the majority of Earth's microbial life has been sitting beneath our feet the whole time, quiet, patient, and entirely indifferent to our existence. To put this in another frame, consider what we have mapped and explored. We have photographed the surface of Mars in extraordinary detail. We have sent spacecraft beyond the outer planets and received images back across billions of miles of space. We have built instruments sensitive enough to detect gravitational waves from colliding black holes a billion light years away. And beneath the ground we walk on, there is an entire second biosphere that we have barely touched. The inhabited zone of this planet is not the thin shell between the rock below and the sky above. The inhabited zone extends kilometers into the rock itself. The biosphere is not a surface. It is a volume. And most of that volume we have never visited, never sampled, never described. Most of the living world on Earth remains unknown to us. Understanding what is down there, how it lives, what it tells us about life itself, is one of the great remaining projects of biology. We are, in a meaningful sense, still discovering our own planet. The surface we stand on is the edge of the story. The deeper chapters have barely been opened. There is also a practical dimension to the size of the deep biosphere that goes beyond pure science. Humans are increasingly doing things underground. Mining, drilling for oil and gas, injecting carbon dioxide into deep formations for storage, pumping water from deep aquifers. Every one of these activities happens inside the deep biosphere. We are operating in someone else's world, and the organisms that live there respond to what we do. Deep bacteria can produce methane from injected carbon dioxide, converting our carbon storage back into a greenhouse gas. They can corrode pipes and infrastructure. They can alter the chemistry of groundwater in ways we do not intend. Understanding the deep biosphere is not only a matter of scientific curiosity, it is a matter of learning to share the planet we actually live on, rather than the simplified version we thought we understood. To understand how life survives in the deep biosphere, you have to let go of almost everything you know about how organisms get energy. On the surface, energy flows from the sun. Green plants and cyanobacteria convert sunlight into chemical energy through photosynthesis. That chemical energy flows through every food chain on the planet. When a lion eats a zebra, it is ultimately consuming energy that entered the biosphere as sunlight. The sun is the engine. Everything else is downstream. In the deep biosphere, there is no downstream from the sun. The sun's influence does not reach. Its photons have never touched the ancient fracture water where these organisms live, and yet organisms live there, which means they have found another engine. They found several. The most fundamental energy source available deep underground is chemistry, specifically the chemical reactions that occur when water interacts with rock. Consider what happens when water moves through iron-rich rock at depth. The iron in the rock is in a reduced chemical state. The water contains small amounts of dissolved materials. When these come into contact, chemistry happens. Hydrogen gas is produced. Sulfur compounds are produced. Methane in some settings. These are energy-rich molecules, and bacteria have evolved over billions of years to use them as fuel. A bacterium that harvests energy from hydrogen is not doing anything metaphysically different from a plant harvesting energy from sunlight. In both cases, the organism is capturing energy from its environment and using it to drive the chemical reactions of life. The source of the energy is different. The principle is identical. Some deep bacteria breathe sulfate instead of oxygen. On the surface, oxygen is the electron acceptor of choice. When our cells process food, they hand off electrons to oxygen molecules, producing water as a byproduct. Deep bacteria, living in environments with no oxygen, hand their electrons to sulfate instead, producing hydrogen sulfide as a byproduct. The chemistry is different. The logic is the same. Others derive energy from the decay of radioactive elements in the surrounding rock. Uranium and thorium are present in trace amounts in most rock. As they decay, they release radiation that interacts with the water in nearby fractures. This process, called radiolysis, splits water molecules and produces hydrogen gas and oxidants. An organism that can harvest that hydrogen has tapped a nuclear power source. Not metaphorically. The organism is genuinely running on the energy released by radioactive decay in the surrounding stone. Because radioactive elements decay on timescales of billions of years, the energy supply for these organisms is essentially inexhaustible on any biological timescale. Some organisms go even further in their metabolic creativity. Bacteria have been found that can oxidize iron directly from the mineral matrix of the rock. Others strip electrons from manganese. Still others participate in the cycling of carbon through deep systems, converting carbon dioxide to methane or methane back to carbon dioxide, depending on the local chemistry. The metabolic diversity of the deep biosphere rivals anything found on the surface. And then there is pyrite. Fool's gold. The glittery mineral most associated with disappointed prospectors and dramatic cave walls. Deep bacteria have been found that quite literally eat pyrite, extracting energy from the sulfur it contains. Researchers studying these organisms in Canadian gold mines describe their excitement in unusually warm terms for scientific papers. One described it as being like being a kid again, because the universe keeps revealing that what we thought were rules are just suggestions. That life has been quietly finding workarounds since long before we were here to write the rules down. The metabolic diversity of the deep biosphere also has practical value. Some deep bacteria produce enzymes that function efficiently at high temperature and high pressure. These enzymes, shaped by billions of years of evolution in extreme conditions, have industrial applications: biofuel production, waste treatment, pharmaceutical synthesis. The chemistry that evolved to process rock and the deep earth turns out to have uses in entirely different contexts. Some deep-dwelling bacteria produce compounds with antibiotic properties. In an era when antibiotic resistance is one of the most serious challenges facing medicine, this is not trivial. Evolution in the deep biosphere has been running its own molecular experiments for a very long time, in conditions very different from the surface. The molecules it has produced are genuinely novel. Some of them kill bacteria that nothing on the surface can touch. What this metabolic creativity reveals is that life is not a fragile, contingent phenomenon that requires a very specific set of surface conditions. Life is a chemistry, and chemistry happens wherever energy gradients exist. Underground, energy gradients exist everywhere that water meets rock and radiation enters the picture, which is to say practically everywhere below the surface of the planet, to depths we would never have thought to look. The deep biosphere also offers a particular lesson about time and biology that we do not learn from surface life. Surface life is urgent because resources are competitive. If you do not eat, something else will eat what you might have eaten. If you do not reproduce, your lineage ends. The pressures of the surface world make biology fast. But fast biology is fragile biology. It depends on the competition remaining balanced, the resources remaining available, the conditions remaining within bounds. Deep biology made a different trade. It gave up speed for stability. It gave up competition for persistence. It stripped away everything that was not necessary for simple, indefinite continuation. And in doing so, it bought something that nothing on the surface has. Not just a long life, not just a long species, but the near-permanent continuation of a biological lineage in conditions that barely change, protected by kilometers of rock from every catastrophe the surface has ever suffered. The surface has had 5 mass extinctions. The deep biosphere has had none. The surface has gone through ice ages and volcanic winters and asteroid impacts and the slow grinding of tectonic plates reshaping the world. And in the deep fractures, in the ancient water, the bold traveler and its kind have continued. Undisturbed, patient, alive. The deep biosphere is not just a scientific curiosity. It is a reminder that the rules of life are written more loosely than we assumed. That where there is chemistry, there can be life. That darkness and pressure and the absence of oxygen are not barriers. They are just conditions. And life has learned to work with conditions far worse than those. The existence of these chemical energy sources also has implications for how we think about the origin of life itself. The very first organisms on Earth could not have depended on photosynthesis, because photosynthesis had not yet evolved. The earliest life must have used chemical energy sources, exactly the kind used by the deep biosphere today. In a sense, the organisms we find in deep rock fractures may be living examples of the earliest metabolic strategies on Earth. Not relics in the traditional sense, organisms that have maintained a way of life 3 or 4 billion years old, because that way of life still works perfectly well in the conditions where they live. When we study the deep biosphere, we may be studying the closest thing we have to a window into the chemistry of the very first life on Earth. In 2008, a team of scientists from Berkeley Lab, Princeton, and several other institutions published a paper in the journal Science. It described a discovery unlike anything in the history of biology. They had been drilling in the Mponeng gold mine near Johannesburg, South Africa. Mponeng is one of the deepest mines in the world. Its tunnels reach nearly 4 kilometers below the surface, pushing into some of the oldest rock on the planet. Ancient Precambrian granite and crystalline basement rock formed billions of years ago. At a depth of 2.8 kilometers, in a newly opened section of the mine, water was seeping from cracks in the rock. The team collected 5,600 liters of this water over time. They filtered it carefully, working to prevent contamination from surface organisms or drilling equipment. Then they sequenced the DNA. In any typical environmental sample, the technique of metagenomics reveals dozens or hundreds of species. The ocean, the soil, the human gut, even the air contain complex microbial communities of staggering diversity. The researchers expected something similar, or at least some reduced community of several species adapted to the extreme conditions. What they found was a single species of bacterium made up more than 99.9% of the microorganisms in the sample. Not a dominant species with lesser partners, one species. Alone, an ecosystem of one. The researchers named it Candidatus Desulforudis, audaxviator. The genus name, Desulforudis, comes from the Latin for from sulfur and rod, describing the organism's shape and its energy metabolism. The species name, audaxviator, means bold traveler. It comes from a quote in Jules Verne's novel Journey to the Center of the Earth. The protagonist discovers a secret inscription in Latin. Descend, bold traveler, and you will attain the center of the earth. What made this discovery extraordinary was not just the isolation, but the completeness. The genome of D. audaxviator revealed an organism that was entirely self-sufficient. It could fix its own carbon from carbon dioxide in the surrounding water. It could fix its own nitrogen from molecular nitrogen or from ammonia released by the surrounding rock. It got its energy from hydrogen produced by the radiolysis of water, driven by uranium and thorium decay in the ancient basement rock. It used sulfate as its electron acceptor in place of oxygen, producing sulfide as a byproduct. It needed nothing from the surface world. No photosynthesis-derived organic carbon. No oxygen. No sunlight, directly or indirectly. The water in which it lived had not exchanged with surface water for an estimated 25 million years. That is before our hominin ancestors diverged from the great apes. Before the Alps reached their current height. Before most of the current ocean floor existed. D. audaxviator was not just surviving in isolation. It had built, alone, within its single genome, the complete biological machinery for a fully independent existence. Producer, consumer, recycler. All of it folded into 4 micrometers of a rod-shaped bacterium, living in complete darkness in water that had not seen the sky since before humans walked the earth. Biologists sometimes talk about ecosystems as requiring multiple components. A grassland needs grasses and grazers and predators and decomposers. Removing any piece changes the whole. D. audaxviator demonstrated that an ecosystem can, in principle, be encoded in a single genome. One organism can be everything. The organism forms protective spores when conditions become unfavorable, safeguarding its DNA from heat, extreme pH, and lack of water. It carries a flagellum and can swim through fracture water. Over its long history, it acquired genes from archaea, the other ancient domain of life, borrowing metabolic tricks from a different branch of the tree of life entirely. Its genome contains 2,157 genes, a surprisingly rich toolkit for an organism living in near-total resource deprivation. Since the original discovery, researchers have found related organisms in other deep locations. In western Siberia at 2 kilometers depth, in Death Valley, California, far below the dry surface, in mines and boreholes across multiple continents, wherever ancient fractured rock meets ancient water and radioactive minerals are present, something related to D. audaxviator seems to find its way. And despite being geographically separated by vast distances, the genomes of D. audaxviator populations in South Africa, Siberia, and North America are more than 99% identical. For organisms supposedly isolated for millions of years, this is deeply unexpected. Either the population is more connected underground than we thought, or the genome is so perfectly adapted that evolution has had nothing to improve upon in all that time. The bold traveler has already found, in its ancient DNA, the optimal solution for its world. The bold traveler is proof, not just of life in an unexpected place, proof that the concept of a minimum viable ecosystem, the smallest possible complete living system, is not a theoretical limit, it is an address. And the address is 2.8 kilometers below a gold mine in South Africa. What the discovery of audaxviator reveals, more than anything else, is that the concept of self-sufficiency has a biological meaning that our surface-centric view of life never required us to consider. Surface organisms are embedded in webs of dependency. They need other organisms to fix nitrogen, decompose their waste, balance the atmosphere, maintain the chemistry of the soil and sea. No surface organism exists in isolation. Every one of them is part of a system, and the system is what is truly self-sufficient, not any individual species. Audaxviator broke that rule. One species, one genome, one organism encoding the complete requirements of a living system. It is the exception that proves just how unusual such self-sufficiency is, and how completely the deep biosphere can differ from the surface world we take for granted. The researchers at Berkeley Lab put it simply. One question, they said, has arisen when considering whether other planets can support life. Can organisms exist independently, without access even to the sun? The answer is yes. And here is the proof. One of the most disorienting aspects of deep biosphere life is what it does to our sense of biological time. On the surface, life is fast. Bacteria in favorable conditions can double their population in as little as 20 minutes. Even in less favorable conditions, most surface bacteria divide at least once per day. The surface biosphere is characterized by rapid turnover, constant competition, fast evolution, quick response to changing conditions. In the deep biosphere, time moves differently. At 2.8 kilometers down, in the water of the Mponeng mine, audaxviator is estimated to divide approximately once every several hundred to several thousand years. The fracture fluids around it carry so little chemical energy that the organism must be extraordinarily conservative in how it spends what it gets. Most of its energy goes not to growth or reproduction, but to maintenance, to the constant work of repairing damaged proteins and keeping cellular machinery functional, despite the heat and pressure and radiation. A single cell of audaxviator, sitting in its dark fracture in ancient rock, may have been alive in a continuous sense since before the last ice age. It may have been the parent of the cell beside it during the time when Homo sapiens was just beginning to develop language. It may trace its own cellular lineage back to ancestors that were already old when the continents looked different from today. This is not the extreme life of the surface world, where organisms fight for resources and reproduce as fast as possible. This is something else entirely. A mode of existence so different from anything we ordinarily think of as life that our normal concepts barely apply. Not alive in the sense of urgency or activity, alive in the sense of persistence, of continuity, of a biological process that has not stopped even though millions of years of geological history have passed around it. Other organisms in the deep biosphere have similarly extraordinary temporal relationships with their environment. Research published in 2020 described living bacteria recovered from seafloor sediments that were 101 million years old. The sediments, deposited in the South Pacific Gyre during the age of the dinosaurs, had been slowly buried and isolated. When researchers carefully extracted the clay from the center of drill cores and added simple nutrients, the organisms woke up and began metabolizing. 100 million years of isolation, of extreme energy limitation, of near total deprivation. And when given the chance, they came back. The microbes increased by 4 orders of magnitude to more than 1 million cells per cubic centimeter after 65 days of receiving nutrients. Microbes from sediments deposited when the continents were in different positions, when non-avian dinosaurs were alive, when evolution had not yet produced a single primate. Those microbes, in glass vials in a laboratory, ate the nutrients placed before them and began to grow. How is such persistence possible? 2 possibilities exist. The bacteria may have been dividing extremely slowly throughout that entire span, each cell living for millions of years before dividing once. Or they may have been in a state of extreme metabolic suppression, maintaining just the minimum chemical activity required to keep molecular integrity intact against the slow degradation of time. Either way, the outcome is the same. Something that was alive when Tyrannosaurus walked the earth was still alive when human beings dug it up and gave it breakfast. In the Canadian Shield, fracture fluids from mines in Ontario have been dated to residence times between 1 billion and 2.2 billion years. The oldest water accessible by drilling on the surface of the earth. Ancient water from a time when the atmosphere still had less oxygen than today, when the most complex life on the surface was single-celled. That water contains microbial communities, not relics. Not fossils, living communities, processing chemistry, going about whatever it is that a bacterium does when it has been alone in the dark for 1 billion years. 1 billion years ago, multicellular life had not yet evolved on the surface of this planet. The most complex organisms alive were colonial single cells or simple sheets of cells, nothing with tissues or organs, or any of the architectural complexity we associate with animals. The water in those Canadian fractures was sealed when the most sophisticated thing in the ocean was a thin mat of cells photosynthesizing in shallow water. And in that water, life persisted. Slowly, conservatively, patiently, without end. What would it mean to be alive for 1 billion years? The question has no real answer, because these organisms have no perspective on their own duration. They are not aware of time passing. They are not bored or patient or ancient in any experiential sense. They simply continue. But the fact of that continuation is remarkable. On the surface, organisms face constant pressure from predators, competitors, changing environments, disease, accident. The average species on Earth lasts perhaps a few million years before going extinct. Individuals rarely live more than a few decades. The surface biosphere is turbulent, and its turbulence drives the evolution and turnover of life. The deep biosphere is not turbulent. It is stable to a degree the surface never achieves. The temperature changes slowly over geological time, if at all. The chemistry is controlled by the mineralogy of the rock, which changes only through the slowest geological processes. There are no seasons, no weather, no predators, no sudden shifts in resource availability. The conditions in a deep fracture today may be almost identical to the conditions in that fracture 50 million years ago. In that stability, life persists, not by evolving to meet new challenges, not by competing and adapting, by simply maintaining, conserving, enduring. The deep biosphere is the most stable environment on Earth, and its inhabitants have learned, through billions of years of selection, to match their pace to that stability, to become as patient as the rock itself. There is a concept that emerges from studying these organisms, sometimes called biological time dilation, not in the relativistic sense, but in the sense that the rate at which biological time passes depends entirely on the rate at which energy is available. When energy is abundant, biology is fast. Cells divide, organisms grow, populations turn over, evolution accelerates. When energy is scarce, biology slows, division halts, metabolism suppresses. Evolution, which requires reproduction to operate, nearly stops. A bacterium in a deep fracture with almost no energy available is, in a biological sense, barely in time at all. It exists at the extreme slow end of a biological timescale that spans from the frenetic growth of a laboratory flask to the near geological patience of the deep earth. Time, for biology, is not a fixed backdrop. It is a function of energy availability. And in the deepest places on Earth, there is very little energy. So there is very little biological time. And yet life persists. Not all deep biosphere life is as dramatically isolated as the audaxviator. Most of it, in fact, lives in communities. And those communities have their own complexity. The deep subsurface contains, in many locations, networks of organisms that depend on each other in nuanced ways. Bacteria and archaea occupy different metabolic niches within the same fracture system. One organism produces hydrogen that another uses as fuel. One produces sulfate compounds that another uses as an electron acceptor. One breaks down organic molecules that another feeds on. One produces compounds that protect its neighbors from chemical stress. These are real ecosystems, not the rich, visually complex ecosystems of the surface world, with their thousands of species and intricate food webs and seasonal dynamics, but ecosystems nevertheless. Organized chemical communities where different organisms occupy different roles and where the activity of each contributes to the survival of others. The Homestake Mine in Lead, South Dakota, now converted into the Sanford Underground Research Facility, has been the site of detailed microbiological research for more than a decade. The mine is used primarily for high-energy physics experiments, but it also allows scientists to study the deep biosphere at controlled depths. Teams from Northwestern University and other institutions have collected fracture fluids from boreholes at various depths within the mine, spanning from the surface to 1.5 kilometers down. They have cataloged the organisms living at each depth and attempted to understand the ecological relationships between them. The results show a gradient. Near the surface, microbial communities are relatively diverse and include organisms that still depend, directly or indirectly, on organic carbon that ultimately traces back to photosynthesis above. Carbon from dead organisms on the surface is constantly being washed down through soil and into shallow groundwater, providing a dilute but real connection to the solar energy economy. As you go deeper, that connection weakens. The proportion of organisms running on purely geological energy increases. The communities become simpler, more specialized, more dependent on the particular chemistry of the local rock and water. There is something remarkable in that narrowing, because it is not a story of degradation or impoverishment. The deep communities are not broken surface communities. They are their own thing, evolved for their own conditions, with their own logic. Some of them produce compounds that no surface organism has ever made. Their enzymes, built to function under high pressure and heat in the absence of oxygen, are structurally different from surface enzymes in ways chemists are still working to characterize. The organisms themselves represent evolutionary lineages that split from surface life long ago and have been accumulating mutations in isolation ever since. Research on seafloor bacteria buried in million-year-old sediments found that these organisms had evolved differently from their closest surface relatives. Their genomes showed evidence of reduced genetic recombination. Once a mutation appeared in a cell, it tended to stay and spread through the small isolated population, rather than being diluted out by exchange with other organisms. Over millions of years, this produced lineages that were genetically drifting away from their surface cousins, diverging, becoming something distinct. Some researchers have proposed that the deep biosphere may contain organisms from entirely unknown branches of the tree of life. organisms so different from known bacteria and archaea that sequencing their DNA would reveal genetic relationships we have never encountered. The concept of microbial dark matter, organisms detected by genetic analysis but never successfully grown in a laboratory and never fully characterized, is well established in deep biosphere research. Every drilling expedition, every new sample from a new location, turns up surprises. New metabolic strategies, new biochemical pathways, new organisms that belong to groups so poorly characterized that their very position on the tree of life is uncertain. One concept that has emerged from this research is the idea of a deep, hot biosphere, a community not just in cold or moderate temperature rock, but in hot, fractured rock, where the temperature approaches the known limit for life, at temperatures between 80 and 120 degrees Celsius, where most organisms would be instantly destroyed. Specialized archaea have been found in active communities. These hyperthermophiles appear to be ancient. Their metabolic pathways and their genetic sequences suggest lineages that diverged from other life very early. They may be representatives of some of the earliest organisms that ever evolved on Earth, surviving in conditions similar to the hot early planet, when the surface was not yet hospitable to anything. The deep biosphere may therefore be not just an extension of surface life gone underground. It may be a refuge, a place where the earliest lineages of life found conditions similar to where they evolved and stayed, while the rest of life diversified, went to the surface, and eventually produced everything visible. The most ancient life on Earth may be the least visible, hidden in rock, in heat, in the dark. Every expedition into the deep biosphere returns with organisms that revise our picture of the living world, species that belong to entirely new branches of known families, species whose closest relatives on the surface are organisms that diverged from them hundreds of millions of years ago. The pattern is consistent. The deeper you go, the older the world you find. And the older the world you find, the stranger and more instructive it becomes. The ecological relationships in deep communities also reveal something about resilience. A community that has been stable for millions of years, in an environment that barely changes, develops a kind of chemical balance that can absorb small perturbations without collapsing. The organisms are tuned to each other, to the local rock chemistry, to the available water, in ways that have been refined over geological timescales. When humans drill into these systems and alter the chemistry, whether by introducing new compounds or removing ancient water, the communities respond. Sometimes they recover, sometimes they do not. Understanding the resilience of these systems and their limits is part of the practical reason we study them. We are drilling into the deep biosphere with greater frequency every decade. We should know who lives there. The deep biosphere raises a question that sounds like philosophy, but is actually empirical science. Could there be, living in those deep fractures, organisms that are not related to surface life at all? This is not a casual question. It has a name, the shadow biosphere hypothesis. It is taken seriously by a small but committed group of researchers. They point out that we have very limited ways of detecting life that uses fundamentally different chemistry from the life we know. All life we have discovered on Earth shares a common ancestor. Every bacterium, every archaeon, every protist, every plant and animal and fungus traces its lineage back to the same origin. We know this because we have found the same basic biochemical machinery in every living thing we have ever studied. The same genetic code, the same DNA and RNA and protein synthesis apparatus, the same set of 20 amino acids, the same basic lipid membranes. The tree of life has many branches, but one root. That root, however, is not the only possible starting point. Life does not have a unique recipe. It has the recipe that worked, the one that survived and diversified and eventually produced everything alive today. But in the 4 billion years since life first arose on Earth, there may have been other experiments, other chemistries, other starts. If any of those alternative forms of life persisted, quietly, in isolated niches where the dominant chemistry could not reach them, they might still be here. Paul Davies, a physicist at Arizona State University, has advocated for systematic searches in extreme environments for exactly this reason. His argument is that if life arose more than once on Earth, the different lineages would compete, and the more successful one would dominate most habitats. But in the most extreme environments, in the hottest or most chemically unusual settings, a different lineage might have carved out a niche where it persists without being outcompeted. Davies specifically suggested looking at environments near volcanic vents at temperatures above what known organisms can survive. If you found something metabolically active at temperatures 300 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit, that would be a candidate for shadow life, something that cannot be explained by the biochemistry we know. If you found, in some isolated deep aquifer, an organism that used a different genetic code or a fundamentally different molecular architecture, that would be extraordinary. Evidence of a second origin of life on Earth, an entirely separate lineage, living alongside ours without our ever having known. We have not found such an organism, but we have barely looked. The fraction of the deep biosphere sampled in a rigorous contamination-controlled way is genuinely small. The techniques for growing and characterizing organisms that have never been successfully cultured are still developing. The conceptual frameworks for recognizing fundamentally different biochemistry are still being built. And there is an additional challenge. Our detection methods for life are tuned to the biochemistry we already know. We look for DNA with a genetic code identical to the one used by all known life. We look for specific lipid structures and metabolites that we recognize because we have found them before. If something alive in the deep biosphere uses a different code, different molecules, a different architecture entirely, our tools might not recognize it as biological at all. We might look at a shadow organism in a sample and classify it as an inorganic chemical artifact. We might have already done this. Researchers are working on broader detection strategies, looking for chemical disequilibria, for unexpected ordered complexity, for isotopic signatures that suggest biological processes without assuming any particular biochemistry. These approaches are still developing. The deep biosphere is a logical place to search precisely because its isolation is so extreme. In isolated environments, evolution runs its own experiments. The more isolated, the more unusual the potential outcomes. A lineage sealed in fracture water for 1 billion years, with no connection to the surface biosphere, has had 1 billion years to diverge from what we know. What it may have become, if it survived at all, is genuinely unknown and genuinely interesting. The shadow biosphere hypothesis may be wrong. Life may have arisen once and only once, and everything in the deep biosphere may trace its lineage back to the same ancestor as every oak tree and every octopus. But the possibility is real enough to take seriously. And the deep biosphere, ancient and vast and barely explored, is the most likely place to find the answer. There is a final reason the shadow biosphere matters beyond pure curiosity. If we discover evidence of a second origin of life on Earth, in our own planet's rock, that would transform our estimate of how common life is in the universe. 2 independent origins of life on the same planet would imply that the origin of life is not the rare, difficult event we sometimes assume it to be. It would imply that wherever conditions permit, life tends to arise. That the universe, with its billions of galaxies and billions of planets per galaxy, is probably very full indeed. The shadow biosphere hypothesis is not just about whether something strange lives under our feet. It is about whether life is a cosmic accident or a cosmic inevitability. That is a question worth asking. And the dark, deep rock beneath our feet may be the place where we finally get an answer. There is a final reason the shadow biosphere matters beyond pure curiosity. If we discover evidence of a second origin of life on Earth, in our own planet's rock, that would transform our estimate of how common life is in the universe. Two independent origins of life on the same planet would imply that the origin of life is not the rare, difficult event we sometimes assume it to be. It would imply that wherever conditions permit, life tends to arise, and that the universe, with its billions of galaxies and billions of planets per galaxy, is probably very full. When scientists discuss where life might exist elsewhere in the solar system, the conversation has historically focused on the surface, on liquid water at the surface, on habitable temperatures at the surface, on atmospheric chemistry detectable from space. The discovery of the deep biosphere has shifted that conversation fundamentally. If life can exist deep underground, independent of solar energy, in environments of extreme heat and darkness, then the habitable zone is not a thin band of orbits around a star. It is wherever rock meets water and chemistry provides energy. It extends wherever rock meets water and chemistry provides energy. And in the solar system, rock and water and chemistry are found in places we never considered hospitable. Mars is the most obvious candidate. The Martian surface today is cold, dry, and bombarded by ultraviolet radiation. If life ever existed there, it almost certainly could not survive on the surface today. But Mars has a subsurface. It has ancient rock. It almost certainly has water ice below the surface, and possibly liquid water in deep formations warmed by geothermal heat. If life ever arose on Mars, it may have retreated underground as the surface became hostile. And if it retreated underground, it could, in principle, still be there, living slowly, breathing sulfate, eating hydrogen from radiolysis in ancient rock, doing what audaxviator does in Martian stone right now. The timescales are right. Mars likely had liquid water at the surface for hundreds of millions of years in its early history. That is long enough for life to arise, by the precedent of Earth. And once life has a foothold in rock, once it has found the geological energy sources that require no sun, it can persist through almost any surface catastrophe. Enceladus is another candidate. The small moon of Saturn has a global subsurface ocean beneath its icy shell, kept liquid by tidal heating from Saturn's gravity. That ocean is in contact with the rocky seafloor. Water, rock, heat, chemistry. It is exactly the environment of the deep biosphere on Earth, replicated on a moon 400 times farther from the Sun. The Cassini spacecraft detected hydrogen in plumes of water erupting from Enceladus into space. Hydrogen is what audaxviator eats. That parallel is not proof. But it is not nothing. Europa, the icy moon of Jupiter, has a similar subsurface ocean. Ganymede and Callisto have subsurface oceans of their own. Titan, Saturn's largest moon, has lakes of liquid methane and a complex organic chemistry, though not water-based. The solar system is full of places where rock and liquid interact under conditions of chemical energy, in total darkness, under enormous pressure. All of those places are now candidate habitats, because life on Earth has demonstrated that these conditions are not incompatible with biology. The deep biosphere has not just expanded our sense of where life can exist on Earth. It has expanded our sense of where in the universe life might exist, and what it might look like. We imagine that extraterrestrial life, if it exists, would live the way we live, on a surface, under a star, requiring light. We imagined searching for it with telescopes pointed at atmospheres, looking for the chemical signatures of photosynthesis and respiration. That may still be the right search for surface life. But surface life may be the exception, not the rule. The universe may be full of worlds where the dominant form of life is deep, dark, slow, and entirely invisible from outside. This reframing extends to how we design the search for extraterrestrial life. For decades, the dominant framework was surface first. Find a planet in the habitable zone of its star. Look for signs of a temperate climate. Detect an atmosphere with biosignatures. The assumption was that life would be findable from space, because life would be on the surface. The deep biosphere complicates this. A world with a dead, hostile, observable surface might have a living, active, unobservable interior. We might look at a dead world and call it dead, when beneath its surface, in its ancient rock and ancient water, something is alive that has been alive since before the surface became hostile. The universe may be full of worlds whose surfaces are cold or toxic or irradiated or airless, and beneath those surfaces, in the rock and the ancient water and the long dark, something like audaxviator may be eating hydrogen, breathing sulfate, dividing once per millennium, entirely indifferent to whatever catastrophe made the surface uninhabitable long ago. The deep biosphere tells us that we should not wait for a planet to look welcoming from the outside before asking whether it is inhabited on the inside. The most important habitats on other worlds may be the least accessible ones. That is a challenge for space exploration. But it is also an inspiration, because it means the universe is not limited to the small fraction of planetary surfaces that fall within the convenient temperature and pressure range for life as we pictured it. It is open to any world with rock and water and the slow, patient chemistry of geological time. Which is to say, it is open to a great many worlds indeed. The practical consequence of this understanding is that the instruments we build for the search for extraterrestrial life may need to extend beyond remote observation from space. On Mars, on Enceladus, on Europa, the most important samples may not be on the surface. They may be in the rock and the water, deep down. The surface is just the address. The life, if there is any, may be in the basement. And the basement of another world is very hard to reach. We have landed spacecraft on Mars. We have drilled shallow holes. We have scraped the soil. But no mission has drilled kilometers into Martian rock, into the ancient fracture water where Martian life, if it exists, is most likely to be found. That mission has not yet been designed. But the deep biosphere of Earth tells us why it should be. Let us spend some time inside the pace of this other world, because the pace itself is one of the most alien things about it. We experience time as urgency. There is always something to do next. The body demands food, rest, movement, interaction. The mind flows from thought to thought. Even sitting still, we are burning calories, processing sensory information, cycling through thousands of involuntary chemical reactions every second. We are fast creatures, living in a fast world. Audaxviator in its fracture experiences something that is not even recognizable as urgency. Its metabolic rate is estimated to be up to 1 million times slower than a typical surface bacterium. 1 million times. The processes that take a fraction of a second in a fast-growing laboratory bacterium take, in audaxviator, something approaching geological time. Think about what that means. The cell is processing chemistry. Ions are moving across membranes. Proteins are folding and unfolding. DNA is being read and repaired. All of this is happening, but so slowly that the cell exists in a relationship with time that has no equivalent in the surface world. There is no urgency to its chemistry, no competition to sharpen its reflexes, no predator that requires it to be fast. There is something almost meditative about this image, not in a romantic sense, in a literal biological sense. The organism has reduced itself to the minimum. It maintains what must be maintained. It does not compete because there is no one to compete with. It does not hurry because hurrying would cost energy it cannot afford. It simply persists. Day after day, millennium after millennium, in a dark crack in ancient rock, in water that has not seen sunlight since before our species existed. Scientists who study deep biosphere organisms sometimes use the phrase zombie bacteria, not with technical precision, but with genuine wonder. Not undead, barely alive, hovering at the absolute boundary of what we are willing to call a living thing, maintaining the minimum chemical gradient that separates a living cell from an inert bag of chemistry, and doing this, without pause, for timescales that dwarf everything we associate with biological life. What is remarkable is that this mode of existence appears to be robust. The organisms do not die. They do not accumulate damage at a rate that overwhelms their repair. Their DNA, bombarded by slow radiation from the surrounding rock, is protected by extraordinarily efficient repair mechanisms. Their proteins, stressed by heat and pressure, fold into structures that are stable in ways surface proteins are not. Evolution has had, in some cases, hundreds of millions of years to refine these survival strategies. The result is something that is not easily killed, that persists not through activity, but through extraordinary and patient endurance. The question of what deep life experiences, if experience is even a meaningful word in this context, has no answer. An organism with no nervous system, no sensory apparatus beyond basic chemotaxis, no capacity for anything resembling perception, does not experience anything in the way we use that word. But the conditions of its existence are so far from ours that contemplating them changes something in how we understand what a life can be. We tend to associate life with motion, with sensation, with change. A living creature responds. It moves toward food, away from threat. It grows, changes, adapts. These are the signs of life as we recognize it. They are the signs of surface life, shaped by the pressures of a world in constant motion. The audaxviator has none of those pressures. There is nothing to move toward, nothing to move away from. No seasonal change to adapt to, no predator to flee, no competitor to outcompete. There is only the fracture, the water, the chemistry, the slow production of energy from radioactivity in the surrounding stone, and the cell maintaining itself, dividing very slowly when enough energy has accumulated. What persists through all of this is the minimum, the bare chemical fact of being alive, and that minimum, it turns out, is very durable, very patient, very good at outlasting everything else. Surface life, with all its urgency and complexity, has produced things of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. But it has also produced fragility. It depends on conditions staying within narrow bounds. Deep life has no such dependence. It has stripped itself down to what endures. There is a concept in biology called the minimum free energy state of life, the absolute minimum chemical activity that can still be called alive. Deep biosphere organisms may be our best window into what that boundary actually looks like. They are as close to that limit as we have found. Not dead, not dormant in the way a bacterial spore is dormant, inactive and waiting for better conditions. Actually alive. Actually metabolizing, just very, very slowly. On a timescale that makes our own brief existence feel like the blink of a bright and hurried light. The slow life asks a question that has no clean answer. When we say that something is alive, what is the minimum requirement? Is it metabolism? Is it reproduction? Is it response to environment? Deep biosphere organisms meet all three criteria, but in ways so attenuated, so stretched across geological time, that our intuitive sense of what alive means becomes uncertain. They are alive. They are just alive in a way that we have no prior experience for, in a way that requires us to expand the word itself. The practical applications of understanding deep biosphere metabolism extend in unexpected directions. The enzymes of deep bacteria evolved to function at high pressure, high temperature, and very low energy availability, are structurally robust in ways surface enzymes are not. Chemists and biochemists are studying these enzymes for use in industrial processes that take place under similar conditions. The discovery that life can operate 1,000,000 times more slowly than we assumed also has implications for how we design long-duration space missions. An organism persisting for millions of years on minimal energy, in isolation, in the dark, is a model for what biological life support might look like on long journeys. The deep biosphere is not only a scientific curiosity, it is an engineering school for extreme conditions. The deep biosphere also offers a particular lesson about time and biology that we do not learn from surface life. Surface life is urgent because resources are competitive. If you do not eat, something else will eat what you might have eaten. If you do not reproduce, your lineage ends. The pressures of the surface world make biology fast, but fast biology is fragile biology. It depends on the competition remaining balanced, the resources remaining available, the conditions remaining within bounds. Deep biology made a different trade. It gave up speed for stability. It gave up competition for persistence. It stripped away everything that was not necessary for simple, indefinite continuation. And in doing so, it bought something that nothing on the surface has. Not just a long life, not just a long species, but the near-permanent continuation of a biological lineage in conditions that barely change, protected by kilometers of rock from every catastrophe the surface has ever suffered. The surface has had 5 mass extinctions. The deep biosphere has had none. The surface has gone through ice ages and volcanic winters and asteroid impacts and the slow grinding of tectonic plates reshaping the world. And in the deep fractures, in the ancient water, the bold traveler and its kind have continued. Undisturbed, patient, alive. What does the deep biosphere teach us about life? Several things, none of them comfortable for our sense of life as something rare and special, as something that requires exactly the right conditions, as something that hangs fragile and improbable against the sterile backdrop of the universe. The first lesson is that life is not photosynthetic at its core. This sounds trivial. Of course, there are non-photosynthetic organisms. But the deep biosphere reframes this in a fundamental way. The surface world, with its sunlit oceans and windswept grasslands and forested mountains, is not the world. It is one layer, the largest reservoir of bacterial and archaeal life on this planet. By some estimates, has never been part of the photosynthetic economy. It has been running a completely independent program since before photosynthesis was invented, in the dark. The second lesson is that isolation does not mean sterility. The fracture water of the Canadian Shield, sealed off from the surface for more than 1 billion years, is not empty. It is inhabited. The conditions that produce isolation on the surface tend to kill things, or at least suspend them. But underground isolation, in the presence of water and rock chemistry, does something different. It creates a stable, persistent habitat. The darkness protects as much as it constrains. The third lesson is that life has a temporal stubbornness that we have not fully reckoned with. We think of organisms as dying. Individuals die. Species go extinct. The history of life is in many ways a history of endings. But the deep biosphere suggests that under the right conditions, living lineages can persist for timescales that make the surface history of life look brief. Those billion-year fracture fluids in Canada contain living communities. Those 100-million-year seafloor sediments contained active organisms. The deep earth keeps things alive in a way the surface cannot match. It is a vault as much as an environment. The fourth lesson is that we do not know what is down there, we have sampled a tiny fraction of the accessible deep biosphere. Most of it has never been examined. The organisms we have found have already forced revisions in our understanding of what life can be. What we have not yet found is unknown. And that unknown has a shadow, a parallel origin, an independent solution to the problem of being alive, surviving in the dark beneath our feet. Consider what this means for the question of life in the universe. We once thought that life was a surface phenomenon, that it required the right atmosphere, the right temperature, the right proximity to a star. The definition of habitable meant surface habitable, and the number of habitable worlds in the galaxy was calculated accordingly, limited to planets in the right orbits around the right stars. The deep biosphere expands that definition dramatically. A world that is ice-covered on its surface, with a rocky ocean beneath, and radioactive minerals in its seafloor, is habitable. A world whose surface was sterile billions of years ago, but whose subsurface contains ancient water and ancient rock chemistry, might still be inhabited today. The habitable volume of the universe is larger than we thought, by an amount that is difficult to estimate, but is almost certainly enormous. There is also a fifth lesson, one that does not appear often in the scientific literature, but that seems worth saying out loud. The discovery of the deep biosphere is, in a quiet way, a discovery about persistence, about what it looks like when something simply refuses to stop, not heroically, not dramatically, not in the way that surface life struggles and adapts and evolves through catastrophe, but by finding the minimum and holding it, by becoming exactly what the environment requires, no more, no less, and doing that for 1 billion years. There is something in that worth sitting with, a form of existence defined not by abundance or growth or competition, but by exact sufficiency, by finding the level at which you can persist indefinitely, without excess, without want, without urgency, the minimum life. And in that minimum, something that the rest of the living world, in all its urgency and color and speed, has not been able to match. Duration. Continuity. The simple, extraordinary fact of continuing. The deep biosphere is a mirror. Held up to the surface world, it shows us what our world is not. Not slow, not patient, not minimal, not isolated, not stable. The surface is fast and crowded and competitive and brief. And in that contrast, we see both worlds more clearly. We see that what we think of as normal life, the life of trees and animals and visible things, is one particular solution to the problem of being alive. A very successful solution, a very interesting solution, but not the only one, not even the most common one. Let us close the way we began, with the image of descent. You in your room, and beneath you, through the floor, through the foundations, through the layers of soil and rock and geology, going down a few meters. Soil bacteria, the familiar world of microbiology, the organisms we have known for more than a century, breaking down organic matter, cycling nutrients, keeping the surface world's chemistry in motion. This is the layer we think of when we think of underground life. Busy, diverse, connected to everything above. 100 meters. Groundwater communities, still connected, loosely, to the surface economy above, but already beginning to shift toward geological energy sources. Organisms here still have traces of the photosynthetic world in their diet, but they are starting to look underground, starting to become something different. A kilometer, a different world. Organisms that have not seen sunlight in millions of years. The hydrogen economy of deep rock, sulfate breathers in fracture water at temperatures and pressures that would be fatal to most surface life. Organisms here have been shaped by conditions that have not changed in geological spans. They are beginning to be genuinely alien. 2 kilometers. Deep mine territory. The zone where the audaxviator was found. Where water is 25 million years old. Where a single bacterium may divide once per millennium. Where the ecology of an entire community fits within one genome. Where one species, alone, in the dark, has built everything it needs to survive indefinitely. The ecology of the impossible. 3 kilometers, 4 kilometers, 5. Deepening silence. Organisms whose nearest relatives may be ones we have not yet discovered. Environments we have barely sampled. Ancient water, ancient rock, ancient chemistry, ancient life. And below that, somewhere in the temperature gradient between the habitable and the impossible, the true floor of the living world, the boundary below which no protein can hold its shape and no chemistry can sustain a cell. That boundary exists somewhere. We do not know exactly where. We have not mapped it. What we know is that the world is bigger than we thought. That the boundaries of the habitable are not the boundaries of the visible or the comfortable or the sunlit. That life, when it finds a way to extract energy from its environment and maintain itself against entropy, can do so in darkness and pressure and heat, for timescales that dwarf our civilization by factors of millions. Researchers who work in deep biosphere science often report something that is hard to classify as purely scientific: a shift in perspective. The feeling of having pulled back a curtain on a room you thought you knew. The planet they study is not the planet they thought they were living on. It is deeper, more alive, more patient, more indifferent to the concerns of the surface. One researcher, describing her experience of working in a deep mine to study fracture fluids, said something that stayed with me. She said that she gets genuinely excited when she sees evidence of microbial life, doing its thing without us, without plants, without oxygen, without surface atmosphere. And she said that these kinds of life very well could exist deep within Mars or in the oceans of icy moons right now. She was not speaking about abstractions. She was standing underground, holding ancient water, watching ancient life go about its ancient business. And the connection to other worlds felt, to her, entirely real. There are things alive right now that have never seen the sun, that have been doing whatever passes for being alive, in the dark and the heat and the pressure, since before our kind existed, since before the ice ages, since before the mass extinctions, since before the continents reached their current positions. They do not know we are here. They do not have the biology to know anything at all, in the way we use that word. But they are here, and they have been here, in the rock beneath everything we have ever built or loved or wondered at, for longer than we have words for. The deep biosphere does not know you exist, but now you know it does. That, perhaps, is enough for tonight. Let that settle. The planet is full in ways we never imagined. The dark is not empty, and somewhere in the rock below the city or the forest or the seafloor above which you are resting right now, something is alive. Something that has never needed the light that is going out when you close your eyes. What the deep biosphere gives us, finally, is perspective. Not the kind that diminishes. The kind that expands. Before we knew the deep biosphere was there, we thought we had a reasonably complete picture of life on Earth. We knew about microbes. We knew about extremophiles. We knew the planet was well inhabited. What we did not know was how far down the inhabited zone extended. How old the deepest living things were. How independent, how self-sufficient, how ancient the biosphere really is. Now we know. And the picture is larger. The planet is older and more thoroughly alive than we thought. The rules for what life requires are looser than we thought. The possibilities here and elsewhere in the universe are broader than we thought. That expansion of the picture, That revision of what is possible is what science looks like when it is working, when it finds not what it expected, but what is actually there. What is actually there, in the dark beneath your feet, is something ancient and patient and alive, something that has been doing its work since before our kind existed, and it will keep doing its work long after the last light on the surface has gone out. Let your thoughts slow. Let the question descend into you rather than away from you, down through the layers, past the soil, past the rock, into the long dark where something ancient and alive has been quietly doing its work since before we were. Good night.